Chris Hedges. It's a absolute treat and honor to have you here. You have a very wide audience in Brazil. I don't know if you know of that. Yeah, nice. We always, when we are doing our broadcasting, people refer to you as a anti-imperialist America. That is a reference for us. So I'm going to start. You came here to the UK and you were going to talk about what's been coined as the new censorship and blacklisting as the death of journalism. And my first question to you, how does the so-called new censorship and blacklist differs from our censorship and blacklisting that we know so far?
Right, so blacklisting and censorship is not new, as you point out. What is new is the collaboration of social media and digital platforms with the US government to blacklist and censor. And Matt Taibbi, when he was given access to the Twitter accounts by Elon Musk, found weekly meetings that were composed of the State Department, the Pentagon, the FBI, Homeland Security, and they targeted sites that they wanted removed. And Taibbi found that after those requests were made, those sites disappeared or deplatformed using algorithms and to marginalize those sites, shadow banning, all that kind of stuff. So that is the new censorship, and it's focused on critics of, in the United States, of the mainstream establishment, and it's not just the Democratic Party, because the old established wing of the Republican Party has now fused with the Democratic Party. So figures like Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, Bill Kristol as a right-wing pundit, they've all joined, and it's the anti-Trump wing. And Trump has taken over the Republican Party and has become, in many ways, like a cult. So they're working on their behalf, and left-wing sites are targeted, but also right-wing sites. And it's quite pervasive, quite shocking. And Taibbi, for exposing that now, is being crucified by the media. In fact, he a journalist called Mehdi Hassan on MSNBC accused him of contempt of Congress, and then Plaskett, who was on the committee that Taibbi testified in front of about censorship, sent him a letter threatening him with 5 years of jail time. There's been a series of hit pieces. The Democrats in the hearings were never gave him a chance to speak, called him a so-called journalist. And then you saw the media pick up those clips. And so Taibbi himself is being actively censored for exposing this. But it goes all the way back to Julian, and I'm here for Julian. I've been meeting with his supporters and his family in anticipation of what we very sadly expect to be extradition. We don't know when, but it seems very likely. It could even be tomorrow. I mean, it could be. They won't tell us. And that is part of an entire apparatus that is really effectively shut down any investigations into the inner workings of power. Obama used the Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers. Trump, of course, used the Espionage Act to go after Julian, although he's not a U.S. citizen, doesn't make any sense. But he's a journalist, so that's a whole other step. And for those of us, I worked for the New York Times, for those of us who obtained and published classified information, it's quite frightening.
So can you give us an example how exactly the big tech associate with possibly secret services or the State Department to push the censorship, or is that an independent movement?
No, they formed, it's called I forget the name of it, there's an acronym that Taibbi uses. So it's, but it includes representatives from the State Department, the Pentagon. They're all working together, Homeland Security. And then they will provide information about targeted individuals or sites that they want removed, and they will be removed from social media. So for instance, I had a show on RT America, and the entire archive of that show, 6 years of it, were just erased, were disappeared by YouTube. Now, not one of those shows was on Russia, and none of them violated the guidelines imposed by
Yes, so that's quite concerning what you're saying. So what is the solution, for instance? Do you think those platforms need to be regulated?
Well, so there's a quid pro quo between the big social media platforms like Google and Facebook, and is that they won't be broken up. So they're monopolies, and they want to retain their monopoly, and the Democratic Party will allow them to retain their monopolies if they serve the interests of the establishment, and then so they're so huge, and of course the solution is to antitrust laws to break them up, but that isn't going to happen under a Democratic administration.
So they have the prerogative of self-regulating themselves. So
there's no regulation, and they do the dirty work. And then we should also be clear that they have their own monitors who are usually hired from the security agencies. So there's a complete cross-pollination between those who are in intelligence, in the Defense Department, and then people who were formerly in the military or in intelligence who actually work for these media entities, these social media entities.
What you telling me is probably an increase of something. I don't remember if it was Martin Luther or Malcolm X.
Martin Luther King, you mean?
Yeah. I don't know, one of them, they criticize from the perspective of a black man, the American First Amendment. I remember he was saying, he defined it as a tool of elites that had only served to justify white supremacist rhetoric and attack on civil rights and to silence oppressed minorities. And in the meantime, we do have progressive American journalists praising the First Amendment as a model example to the world. Is that so?
Well, as it's written, yes. But of course, it no longer functions that way. What's happened to constitutional rights, for instance, the right to privacy? So the entire American public, we know because of the disclosures by Edward Snowden, is spied upon, monitored, photographed. And so our rights have been removed by judicial fiat. For instance, in Citizens United, which allows unlimited corporate money to go into campaigns, the Supreme Court has interpreted that as the right to petition the government or a form of free speech. So on paper, we have all sorts of rights, including the First Amendment. But in reality, those rights have been revoked. You can't, when your government watches you 24 hours a day, you can't use the word liberty. That's the relationship between a master and a slave. And we know that's not conjecture. We know they watch us 24 hours a day. And they're building gigantic, supercomputer storage sites in Utah. The amount of information that they have on us. And then you have corporations that have access. It's called the black box industry, and they sell it. So for instance, if you apply to a job, it's a multi-billion-dollar a year business. A corporation will provide to the potential employer everything about you, all your medical records, every time you've been arrested. Without your consent. And private individuals cannot access that information. So we're completely, at this point, we live in a very sophisticated surveillance state that is unlike anything that existed in human history.
Is there hope for freedom of expression and speech in America?
Not unless the system's overthrown. Because the corporate state has no real support. We know they carry out all sorts of policies that don't have any popular support because, of course, they're in the service of global capital. And the more unpopular they become, the more draconian they become, the more they turn to those tools to create a kind of species of corporate totalitarianism. So unless we bring down the system, it will continue, and they've reconfigured economic structures. Most countries, in essence, have lost control of their own economy. I was just in Paris, where the riots are. And these people in the Benelux, most of whom are of color, have just been cast aside by Macron and the corporate capitalists like human refuse. But that's just writ large across the United States. 60% of the American public lives paycheck to paycheck. They don't even have $1,000 or $400, can't remember,
really?
for an emergency expense. I mean, it's quite, and they don't have job security and they don't have benefits and all of that's gone. So that kind of neoliberal ideology, which never made any economic sense, it was put forth because it served the interests of global capital, has distorted countries to such an extent that it has given rise to these demagogues like Trump, Modi, Orban, and others, Bolsonaro, who are the kind of are figures who promise revenge against the system that has destroyed them. And of course, like all demagogues, they're catering to the crowd and telling them what they want to hear, but they're con artists. But they are what's vomited up in a decayed or dysfunctioning society. It's what I saw when I covered the war in Yugoslavia. And the war in Yugoslavia was caused by the economic meltdown of Yugoslavia, not by ancient ethnic hatred. So, yeah.
Well, I wanted to move exactly to that point, the rise and the consolidation of the far right worldwide. And I'd like to better understand, in your view, how the US might have contributed to this, and through its internal contradictions and to its foreign policies, and as you say, through the big techs probably. In one of your articles, you mentioned philosopher Gabriel Rockhill, who points out that fascism never went away. The US did not defeat fascism in the Second World War. He writes, it discreetly internationalized it. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. At the end of World War II, the SS and the Nazi intelligence services, as well as many within the military, were incorporated into the West German government and the American intelligence service in the battle against the Soviets. And so you had a series of black sites in Germany run by former SS officers on behalf of the American intelligence system. There's a very good book on this called Poisoner in Chief by Stephen Kinzer. And he writes a lot about Stanley Gottlieb, who was central to this, but who was using hallucinogenics like LSD as a form of mind control and overseeing all sorts of torture to see that when they could break people and make them compliant. But in the course of this book, hundreds of war criminals, but not just Nazi, but also Japanese war criminals were used in the battle of the Cold War. And that's why even with a few people who were sentenced after the war, and many of whom had been sentenced to death, those sentences were then later converted to life imprisonment, and then a few years later they were released, because that power structure was useful to American intelligence. And of course, Werner von Braun went to the United States to work on the rocket programs. He had designed the V2, NASA. Klaus Barbie, I used to live in Cochabamba, Bolivia, where Klaus Barbie, I saw him living at the time. I went by the name Klaus Altmann. He was the butcher of Lyon, the head of the SS in Lyon, and tortured to death Jean Moulin, the head of the French resistance. And he ended up in Bolivia because he worked for the United States after the war, and they, through the rat line, gave him safe passage and a new identity. He was at the very end of his life, finally extradited to France. But there's just one example of a major war criminal who was recruited by the CIA.
So they have been very helpful.
Well, I don't know if they've been helpful. They've tortured a lot of Union leaders.
To American intelligence.
Yeah, well, America has a strong fascistic strain going all the way back to the Ku Klux Klan, which is kind of an authentically fascist movement. There was wide support, especially from Mussolini in the 1930s, among the business elite, as well as Hitler. I mean, Charles Lindbergh, for instance, and others were very supportive of Hitler. So that fascistic strain has always existed within American society. The racial segregation, and that was very much a model for the Nazis, the way Americans treated Black people, as well as indigenous people. So those strains have always been there.
So let's talk about almost the same right now. How far does the sponsoring of Azov battalion, Nazi militias in Ukraine by America is taking place?
Well,
what can you tell us about
so
that?
I mean, Zelensky, remember, has shut down, banned most opposition parties, and these parties primarily come from the left. At the same time, forces loyal to the old fascist leaders, Bandera and Azov Battalion, as you mentioned, are funded, supported, and these are groups that not only openly embrace a fascistic ideology and look, because the nationalists in Ukraine, like the nationalists in many other parts of Eastern and Central Europe, the Ustasha and Croatia, for instance, were close allies of the Nazis, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, we saw a resurgence throughout Eastern and Central Europe. So I was in Croatia, and even the old symbols of the Ustasha came back, and quite literally, old members of the Ustasha returned to Croatia. I covered the fall of Ceausescu in Romania. There you had the old Iron Guard. They were resurrected. They call themselves the Peasant Party. The guy who ran it had fought in Stalingrad. So with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the revolutions of Eastern and Central Europe, these forces that had been suppressed by communist governments, and that is true in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine was one of the worst. I mean, there were huge numbers of Ukrainians who were in the death camps, who fought for the Nazis. I mean, there was a close collaboration, and these fascist collaborators are celebrated now in Ukraine.
There and others, yeah. We don't even talk them as being neo-Nazis. We talk them as being Nazis, as we understand. There is a historical continuity and never a revision of history.
Well, Bandera was a Nazi. Oh, Nazi was fascist. I mean, so yeah, there's a complete continuity, and they are quite open about celebrating these fascistic figures of the Second World War and essentially attempting to validate the war crimes and atrocities that they committed.
We know that one of the wars is the hybrid warfare against Russia, the hybrid warfare in Brazil against President Lula, the hybrid warfare in China is also full on. For the US, what is a bigger problem, Russia or China?
Well, I would put it the other way. The US is the problem. It's the US that is pursuing aggressive policies, has been pursuing aggressive policies since 1989. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989, so I was well aware of the promises that had been made to Gorbachev not to expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany, because Germany could not be unified without Russian acquiescence. And that promise was made by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the West German foreign minister, by James Baker, then Secretary of State. And they violated those promises by pushing NATO, and they knew the consequences. I mean, at the time in 1989, if you'd asked anyone about the expansion of NATO, they would have found that not only provocative and dangerous, but ludicrous. But it made the arm manufacturers billions. I think there was the hubris of the United States, who started talking about a unipolar world where they would be the sole dominant power within the world. And it is true that Russia was a very broken country immediately. So that's the threat. And of course, we see very aggressive posturing towards China in the South China Sea, and the land masses around China. And that's because the primary business of the US government, depending which administration in power, is the perpetuation of permanent war. It doesn't matter whether the war makes sense. 20 years of warfare in the Middle East didn't make any sense. It was an utter fiasco. But it made the arms industry very wealthy, or increased their profits, just as Ukraine does. Over $150 billion now pumped into Ukraine. A proxy war that will end with a negotiated settlement at some time. Much of Ukraine may exist, where Russia gets control of the Donbass, and is allowed to protect the ethnic Russians in Ukraine, 30 million of them, and there's some kind of neutrality. But the US has already blocked negotiations because their goal, and it's quite cynical, is to degrade the Russian military, isolate Putin from Europe, which they've largely succeeded. But they haven't hurt the Russian economy the way and what they've actually done is push Russia into a closer alliance with China. And that upends the whole policy of the Cold War, which was to keep those two centers estranged. So in fact, I would argue that the 20 years of warfare in the Middle East has been counterproductive because I spent 7 years in the Middle East. Iraq and Iran were always a kind of counterweight. Now you have a Shia government in Baghdad that has a close alliance with Iran, and they have made Iran the preeminent power outside of Israel within the region. So the policies themselves don't even, from a national security point of view, don't make sense for the United States to pursue. But the goal is permanent war. And the people who have preached and pushed permanent war, they never change. It doesn't matter how wrong they are, the Kagans and Elliott Abrams, all the others, John Bolton and everyone else. But of course, they're funded by the war industry. Their think tanks are funded there. So the problem isn't Russia, and the problem isn't China. The problem is the United States.
A question. Trump may be coming back, or maybe not. For many people, they think that Biden or Trump are equally evil, the same side of the coin, two sides of the same coin. But I would say that for Latin America and for the consolidation and segmentation of the ultra-far right, we fear Trump more than we do fear Biden. For instance, we know that Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro's sons met with Bannon and Trump a few times. In our knowledge, we know that Alexander Nix, the former CEO of Cambridge Analytica, confessed to a hidden camera in a documentary Channel 4 that they would be interfering in the elections in 2018. In your opinion, are they equally evil? Or do you think for human rights, state sovereignty, and democratic values, one is worse than the other?
I think what's different is primarily the rhetoric. I mean, let's look at the Palestinians. Does it really make a difference whether it's Trump or Biden? Anybody going to protect the civilians being slaughtered in Jenin? No. The war industry and the intelligence industry, these are largely autonomous, beyond the control of a Trump or Biden. They do whatever they want. And the CIA history in Latin America, including in Brazil, with when was the coup? 61? 64. I mean, it was awful in Brazil. And that was a gift of the CIA, just like Pinochet was in Chile. So in terms of Latin America, I don't see that U.S. policy will change significantly. It is true that just like Reagan supported the junta in Argentina during the Dirty War, and Jimmy Carter didn't, there are differences from that perspective. But in terms of abuse of power, manipulation of power in order to protect American business interests, there's no difference between Trump and Biden. They will, if Lula, for instance, was to nationalize American companies, there would be, as Mossadegh tried to do with British Petroleum in Iran, so they can control their own resources. If something like that happened, you wouldn't notice any difference between Trump and Biden.
Even for the coordination of the far right in the world?
Well, there, of course, a figure like Trump is friendlier to the far right. I mean, he's a demagogue. He has far more in common with a figure like Bolsonaro, like Orban, like others. But these are personalities, and I think we have to begin to recognize that the structural. The problem is are the political economic structures, and the fact that ultimately it's about global corporate power, and is a figure like Biden more personally palatable? Yes. But is there really going to, if for Brazil, is there really going to be a huge difference? Not really. I mean, the rhetoric will be better under a Biden administration, but the differences will be relatively slight.
Well, we see a world changing in some ways through the war in Ukraine, or accelerated by the war in Ukraine. We have prospects of de-dollarization of the economy, and the emergence of a new global players. And it seems that the exercise of American hegemony is under threat. Do you think a multipolar world is arising? Do you think this is a reality?
No, a multipolar world is moving to essentially reconfigure global power very quickly, especially separating themselves. Well, so they, as part of the sanctions against Russia, they severed Russia from SWIFT, the international money transfer system. Hasn't hurt the Russian economy, and they have created alternative forms of, because the SWIFT is using the dollar as the reserve currency, and the day the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, the value of the dollar will plummet significantly. So you have China, you have Iran, you have Cuba, you have also, I think even Brazil. All sorts of countries are now doing foreign exchanges outside of the dollar.
Yeah,
and that
and Egypt.
And Egypt too.
Yeah,
our great ally.
Egypt, and with some exchanges, I think, with Pakistan and
India too.
India, yeah.
So that's very dangerous to the United States, because we know what will happen, because when the pound sterling in the 1950s was no longer the world's reserve currency, the dollar became the world's reserve currency, the UK's economy fell into a kind of death spiral, and that will be devastating. Nobody will buy our debt, and then we fund everything off of debt. The value of the dollar will drop, and it will become almost impossible to maintain the global reach of empire, the 800 military bases that we have around the world. So, and the irony is that the policies that are pursued by the war industry is actually accelerating that process rather than mitigating.
I don't know if you had a chance to see the Financial Times article recently. It was entitled "The Discreet U.S. Campaign to Defend Brazil's Election." And it's a very well-reasoned article, and it announces things that we actually knew in Brazil, but in a very coherent manner. And the article states there was a concerted but unannounced campaign across multiple branches of the U.S. government, including the military, the CIA, the State Department, the Pentagon, and the White House, to preserve the electoral process, which had been openly tried to be subverted by Bolsonaro's attacks on the electoral process. And also that Washington helped with the logistics on the 8th of January. At the same time, the articles criticized Lula for being close to China, says that Lula showed very poor recognition of U.S. campaign. And this article sounds like it's the US passing the bill and with a silent threat. We've helped you, but we could.
Yeah, that's it.
Do you agree with that take?
Yeah.
Is it?
It's a threat.
How can you explain a bit how this is?
Well, that's how they work.
Threat?
I mean, they don't ever do anything for free. I mean, it's like the mafia. If they, show up at your house with something, they're going to want something.
What could they do against Lula, do you think?
Well, what they can do against Lula is curb anything that Lula does to harm U.S. business interests, corporate interests within Brazil, and they will.
And they will. Final question. We know Julian Assange can be extradited at any time, as you said. He could be put in a rendition plane to the US pretty soon. Many people ask what is the difference to be in a supermax here and to be in the US. So can you tell us a little bit what expects Julian Assange in a US prison and in the US court? Why it's so critical not to have him extradited?
Well, the thing is, his prison conditions. I mean, prison conditions in the United States are awful, but so is Belmarsh. I mean, he doesn't even eats alone in his cell. I mean, the conditions are awful in Belmarsh. But if he is extradited, he almost assuredly will be found guilty under the Espionage Act and imprisoned for the rest of his life, 170 years. So that's the fear, because number one, I know Julian, he's a friend of mine, and so there's the personal aspect of what they're doing to a person who never committed a crime. Certainly not the crimes he's charged with. And then also the fact that just to possess classified material, and I possessed classified material as reported for the New York Times, much less to publish it, will be criminalized. That's the conditions will be terrible. They're not, but they're pretty terrible in Belmarsh. But it's more what that will mean for freedom of the press. It will just become impossible to hold governmental power accountable. It won't work. We won't have that tool anymore. And
America will be the great editor to the world of what can be read, of what cannot
well,
be
they
read.
already are in many ways, but it'll be worse.
Chris Hedges, was a pleasure to have you with us. And if you want to tell people how they can subscribe to the Substack.
It's chrishedges.substack.com, and then all of my articles, and I have a weekly show on the Real News. It all comes out on the Substack.
Artis is still airing in Brazil.
Not in America.
Can they see you there still?
No, because RT America was shut down. Yeah, so she was doesn't exist in America.
Well, maybe you can come to a Brazilian TV show.
There you go.
And we can speak truth. Thank you so much for your time and for being here.
Thanks.